Hello Rod and all our friends in Australia. It's a great privilege for me to record this in Cape Town for the Low Carb Down Under series. I wondered what I should talk about because I haven't been speaking on the international scene for at least a year since my trial finally ended and we won the appeal. So I decided what I would do would be to give a series of lectures on a topic that really interests me at the moment. And it's titled, It's the Insulin Resistance, Stupid. And so what I'm going to do is progressively over the next 6 months or so, produce a series of podcasts and videos on the topics as I write them. What inspired me was because I wanted to know more about insulin resistance. And so I looked into it, and of course Gerald was the person who first described it. So I went back and looked at all his work to understand why did he want to study insulin resistance. And in that process, I discovered an enormous amount of really interesting stuff. And I think that you'll really enjoy it. And this is quite a unique series because you will have the lectures as I give them, but then if you want to go and check up for the references and the text, you'll be able to find them either on the Noakes Foundation website or on the crossfit.com website. I'm going to begin by saying when I gave my last talk was at the College of General Practitioners in London on the 20th of May 2018. And there I was asked to speak about what had happened to me over the last 5 years related to my trial and the writing of the Law of Nutrition. And that was such a successful talk that I just wanted to remind some people about the emotion that was raised during the day. So I was asked to talk about Law of Nutrition, how it happened, why we wrote the book, what had happened in the trial. And the book starts with one quotation, and it says, "This train is bound for glory." And many people ask, what does that mean? Well, that's a very famous song, and it's a gospel song. And it was written by the Negro slaves in the United States in the early 19th century. And the train was a series of houses which were placed about 20 miles apart, and that was the distance the slaves could cover in one night, so that they'd go from one safe house to the other safe house overnight. And I made the point that the reason why I won my trial was because I had the good people supporting me, and our train was bound for glory. So I began my talk with this wonderful clip of some people singing that song.
Get on board, y'all. Let's get on down to New Orleans.
So my point is that the train we're on is bound for glory because it's got good people, and there aren't any crooks on our train. And the original quote is, "This train don't carry no statinators, no sugar slaves, no diet dictators. This train is bound for glory, this train." The other great moment was that I was introduced to give the talk by my great friend Peter Bruckner, who I'd converted to the low-carb diet, and of course he's an icon in Australian medicine. And then he converted this whole Australian cricket team, and then they won the World Cricket Cup. Peter believes he's the reason why Australia won the Cricket World Cup. I think it was because I converted him and he converted everyone to the low-carb diet. And the other commonality I have with Peter is that he was involved with the Liverpool Football Club as their medical doctor, and my parents are from Liverpool. So when I finished the talk, I had to do one last thing, and that was play the anthem for the Liverpool Football Club. And of course the anthem is "You'll Never Walk Alone." And I thought that summarizes the low-carb movement, that each of us is a maverick who's taken on the world, and we don't walk alone because we have everyone's support. So when I started playing this song, After about 30 seconds, everyone started singing with it. And then they stood up and started clapping. And the singing went on for the entire duration of the song. And it was such an emotional moment. Everyone was crying and the tears were flowing. It was just one of the most remarkable moments I've had in my academic career, because we were just one, and we felt that we're together and we're walking the same road, but we've got this enormous strength in our unity. So it was an amazing moment for me. And I decided after that moment, I'm withdrawing from speaking internationally, and I'm just going to go home for a year or so and recover my strength, and then I will go back to teaching. So this is one of the first talks I've given since that moment, and I hope you'll enjoy it. So the first thing that happened since that talk was that Marikos Boros and myself finished the revision of our book, The Law of Nutrition, and it's called The Real Food on Trial, and that's the international version, and it's published by Andy Harcom, the famous husband of Zoe Harcom, and we're very happy that it's now right up to date, and we added all the newer information related to my trial and the fact that I won the appeal, and so in the end I was found not guilty on all charges. So that was a nice moment to finish up in. So then what I decided to do was to spend a lot of time writing, but particularly for CrossFit.com. And the first series of articles I took was on waterlogged, or the hyponatremia of exercise. And what happened was, when I published this book, Waterlogged, there was a lot of stuff that we didn't publish because it was too contentious, because it showed the way industry had manipulated the science to the detriment of runners. And I was able to collate all the material that we didn't put into Waterlogged into a series of talks. And I think that if you're interested in sports medicine, you'll find those articles really interesting, not only from a sports medicine point of view, but the way the science was distorted. And that really influenced my understanding of how industry distorts the science, and that affects all our health. And there's no better example than this, waterlogged, but also in the way that diet has been manipulated, and we've been told to believe something that is simply not true. And I think when you've seen all the articles I'm writing on it's the insulin resistance stupid, you'll realize there just never was any evidence. So here's the first CrossFit article that I wrote, and there's a list of all the topics, and you'll see we start with Gerald Raven, and I'm going to discuss Gerald Raven in more detail today. We go through Robert Atkins, then we have President Eisenhower's heart attack, and he's the first person, a famous person, to be prescribed Ancel Keys's low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. And the outcome was terrible, because he developed progressive coronary artery disease and died in congestive heart failure. And he rigorously followed the diet. And no one will ever tell you that the diet was completely experimental. It's given to the President of the United States, and he dies of coronary artery disease. And no one tells you that actually the diet failed. And then for the last 5 columns, I look at Ancel Keys in a way that I don't believe he's ever been looked at, and show that he was not a good guy. He was not a good scientist. He manipulated the science. He didn't falsify the data, but he hid data that disproved his hypothesis. And he was driven purely by ego and the desire to become a famous scientist and influence the whole world. And he achieved that. But there never was any evidence that he was correct. So in the 10th column, the final act, I act as the prosecution and charge him with all these crimes against science. And no one has done it in the detail that I did, because they didn't have the time, and I just had the time, and it's astonishing. You will not believe how the evidence was distorted. And so I hope over the next few months to lead up to show you exactly why that happened. So let's start with Gerald Raven, who is an absolute icon because he described the metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance and what he called Syndrome X. And what I'm going to show you today is that he got it 50% right. And unfortunately, he quit at the end. And he quit because he realized that a low carbohydrate diet was the solution to the metabolic syndrome. But he also knew that as a professor of medicine at Stanford University, if he were to actively promote a high-fat diet, his career would have been ended. And he slipped off the bandwagon and chose to muddy the water. And he never promoted the real diet that would prevent insulin resistance and the metabolic syndrome. So this is a guy who should have won the Nobel Prize for discovering this condition, insulin resistance, which in my opinion is the single most important medical condition in the world. And he describes it. But he falls short because he gets close to the cure, but then he doesn't have the courage to push it through. Because he knew that his career would have been destroyed if he'd ever said that. Because the career of John Yudkin was destroyed when he said that sugar causes heart disease. And Raven would have been murdered if he'd said it's the low-fat diet that's causing heart disease. So I'm going to show you how he gives us the evidence. It's all there, and then he backs off, sadly. And as a consequence, the low-carb movement is set back probably 50 years. Whereas if he'd had the courage to push it through, the low-carb diet would have been accepted as treatment for heart disease, obesity, diabetes, already in the 80s. So here's one of his first papers in 1966 where he looks at glucose, insulin, triglyceride responses to high and low carbohydrate diets. And this was a monumental study because it was to lead the field down the direction that the body responds differently to low carbohydrate diets than to high carbohydrate diets. And so already in this study published in 1966, he was able to show that blood triglyceride concentrations were lower on the left columns of this, on the high-fat diet, but they rose on the high carbohydrate diet. And interestingly, in red, he showed that cholesterol actually went up on the high carbohydrate diet, came down on the high-fat diet, and phospholipids were pretty much the same. So here, showing that a very high-fat diet, 68% fat, and only 17% carbohydrates, produced a reduction in triglycerides. And it's important to notice that this was a 17% carbohydrate diet compared to an 85% carbohydrate diet. This was the lowest carbohydrate diet he ever studied. He eventually got hung up on 40% carbohydrate diets and called that a low carbohydrate diet and compared that to 60% carbohydrate diets. So that was the range he worked in. Whereas here he's working in a 17% carbohydrate versus 85% carbohydrate. So you would ask, or at least I would ask, what would happen if you went below 17%? But he never did that. In fact, he went back up to higher carbohydrate diets. And you have to ask, why did that happen? And I would argue that was pressure, purely pressure from his colleagues. And so in this paper in 1966, he says, all measures of glucose and insulin responses to carbohydrate ingestion correlate very well with the triglyceride response. So he said that the glucose and insulin response is very similar to the triglyceride response. The worse the insulin glucose response, the worse the triglyceride response. And then he said, furthermore, our results indicate that one may accurately predict the magnitude of this triglyceride response. When tested during an ad libitum diet period, the more abnormal the glucose tolerance test and the higher the accompanying rises in plasma insulin and immunoreactive insulin, the greater the subsequent triglyceride rise on ingestion of a high carbohydrate diet. So what he's saying is the more the insulin response to carbohydrates, the higher the triglyceride response. Finally, the degree of the triglyceride response on either a low or high carbohydrate diet correlated very well with the estimated integral of both plasma and glucose concentrations during the 9 hours of a representative day of ingestion of these diets. So what he's saying again is that there are individual differences, and those who respond most abnormally to glucose because they secrete more insulin have a higher triglyceride response. And he concluded hyperinsulinemia may be an important cause of the enhanced hepatic triglyceride production that underlies endogenous hypertriglyceridemia. So he has already linked carbohydrates to high triglyceride concentrations through the action of insulin. He then went further and measured the production of triglycerides in the liver, and that's the endogenous triglyceride production. And he showed that there was a very close relationship between the secretion rate of triglyceride from the liver, and that's the grouping on the left, and the triglyceride concentration. So the more triglyceride produced by the liver, the higher the triglyceride concentration, which makes sense. And then he was able to show on the right graphs that the average plasma insulin concentration was linearly related to the average plasma triglyceride concentration. So there he had it. It looks like insulin is driving triglyceride production in the liver, and that's driving the blood triglyceride concentration. So he concluded in most patients, the degree to which a high carbohydrate diet stimulates hepatic triglyceride secretion is directly related to the insulin response produced by that diet. So we can conclude already by 1967, Raven knew that there was a link between dietary carbohydrates, insulin, and high triglycerides in the bloodstream. And he knew that insulin was the driver of the hypertriglyceridemia. So if he now were to know that high triglyceride levels are dangerous, he had to conclude that carbohydrates and insulin were driving it. So the question is, what did people know about triglycerides in that day? And this is 1967. Was there anyone interested in triglycerides being a risk factor for heart disease? He also knew that individuals differed in the extent to which carbohydrates would elevate their blood triglyceride concentrations, and this was influenced by their glucose tolerance. So in modern terms, he was already understanding that the more insulin resistant you were, the higher your insulin concentration when you ingest carbohydrate, and the higher the triglyceride concentrations. And so if he knew that triglycerides were harmful to long-term health, he had to know that the people who were more insulin resistant would be more likely to develop heart disease if they ate a high carbohydrate diet. What he had yet to learn was the potential link between carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia and coronary heart disease, especially in those with type 2 diabetes mellitus. So what he was showing was this condition of carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia. And what he had to now discover was that potentially dangerous to your coronary arteries, particularly in those people with type 2 diabetes. And the answer was that he had to know that triglycerides were potentially toxic, because there was a whole series of information available in the 1950s, mainly provided by Margaret Albrink and Evelyn Mann from New Haven in Connecticut, to show that triglycerides were much more likely to be elevated in persons with heart disease than were cholesterol concentrations. So here's one of their studies of Albrink and Mann, showing in the top graph blood cholesterol concentrations in 82 males with coronary heart disease compared to 134 males with normal coronary, they had not suffered coronary artery disease. And you can see that just looking at it, it looks like at all ages, the cholesterol levels are more likely to be elevated in the person with coronary artery disease. So that you could conclude from that cholesterol might be more elevated in people with coronary artery disease. But then these two workers showed that actually if you looked at triglycerides, that they were much more likely to be elevated in people who had coronary artery disease. And that's shown in the top graph, where many more of the values sit above the line than in the people with normal hearts. So just looking at that, you'd say, my gosh, it looks to us like triglycerides are more likely to be elevated in men with heart disease than in men without heart disease. They then plotted as a histogram the triglyceride concentrations in the top graph, and in the red, those are the normal values, and in the blue are the values for the people with coronary artery disease, and you can see that the coronary artery disease curve is shifted to the right, suggesting that they're more likely to have high values of triglycerides in people with coronary artery disease. Whereas in the bottom graphs, you'll see the cholesterol, there's much more greater overlap. So again, looking at those two graphs, you would say triglycerides were much more likely to be elevated in people with coronary artery disease. They then went and looked at the percentage of people having elevated serum triglyceride concentrations at different ages and depending on whether they had coronary artery disease or angina. And what they show on the extreme left is that the vast majority of normal people have triglycerides that are below the average of 5.5 milliequivalents per liter. So something like 82% or 85% of people have normal triglycerides at a young age, and only a small percentage peep up above the line, showing that they have elevated triglyceride concentrations. And as you can see, as we go to 40 to 59, the percentage increases with elevated triglycerides. But then when you come to coronary artery disease, the vast majority, well over 75%, have elevated triglyceride concentrations. And when you come to people with active coronary artery disease that have angina, it's more like 85%. So again, looking at that picture, you'd think, my gosh, triglycerides tend to be elevated in people with coronary artery disease. So the authors concluded, in summary, elevations of serum triglycerides above 5.5 milliequivalents per liter occurred in only 5% of normal young adults, in at most 30% of normal men over 50, and in 85 to 90% of patients with coronary artery disease. And then they made the point, few if any other lipid measurements which have been reported affect such a clear-cut separation between those people with normal coronary arteries and those with coronary artery disease. And they said the present report suggests that an error in the metabolism of triglycerides is the lipid abnormality operative in coronary artery disease. So remember, this is in 1955, long before Raven shows what's causing elevated triglycerides. In the next paper, the same authors do exactly the same. And here they look at cholesterol and triglyceride concentrations, the cumulative percentages of people with cholesterol or triglyceride values. And what you see on the left is in blue are the normal young men from 20 to 29. And you'll see that 90% have cholesterol values which would be considered normal. Whereas if you look at the green curve, that is for people with coronary artery disease at all ages. And you can see at 55%, only 55% have a normal cholesterol concentration. But if you look at the triglycerides, you'll see again, for the normal people, majority have a normal triglyceride, but only 20% of the men, and that's the green curve, only 20% have a normal triglyceride concentration, indicating 80% have abnormal or elevated triglycerides, which is substantially more than have elevated cholesterol concentrations. And the picture for the women in the next slide is pretty much similar, but there are fewer women with very elevated triglyceride concentrations. So they concluded again, the serum triglyceride levels in this series appeared to provide a better separation between normal persons and persons with coronary artery disease than the reported measurements of other serum lipids, and may provide the most accurate single indication yet available of the biochemical lipid deficit recognizable in diseases of the coronary arteries. And then in their next study, which they reported somewhat later, they looked back at all the studies they'd been doing since 1930 to 1960. So they had 30 years of observations in patients with diabetes mellitus and the measurements of cholesterol and triglyceride concentrations. And what this slide shows is the relationship between serum triglycerides and dietary fat calories in 1931, and that's the blue dots on the right-hand side of the curve. And there you can see that on the bottom axis is the percentage of fat calories. And you'll see that the blue dots are much lower than the red dots on the left, which are the data from the 1950s and the 1960s, when people were eating lower fat diets, they were eating diets containing about 40% of fat. And there you can see that the triglycerides appear to be higher, and the reason would be because they're eating more carbohydrates and less fat. So if you look at that curve, the explanation would be that in the 1930s, people with diabetes were eating higher fat diets, 55 to 65%, but by the 1950s, they were eating a 40% fat diet, and as a consequence, their triglycerides were higher, and some were substantially very much higher. And so they concluded, at least in diabetic persons, the present study suggests that the increased coronary rate over the past 30 years has not been associated with any change in the serum cholesterol, but rather with an increased triglyceride concentration. And the dietary change has been in the direction of lower fat and higher carbohydrate intake, rather than the higher fat reported for the country as a whole. So, in fact, the fat intake for the country hadn't gone up, so the diabetic patients were following the trends for the nation. Indeed, starvation, rigorous calorie restriction, and stringent high-fat, low-carbohydrate diets were the only form of therapy for diabetes prior to the development of insulin. A similar diet, liberal in fat but low in carbohydrate, was carried over in the early part of the 1930s when the present study began. But in recent years, fat intake has been reduced to that of the country as a whole, and carbohydrate intake has been liberalized. Thus, the rising triglyceride concentration of diabetics is associated with a trend towards decreasing dietary fat and increasing carbohydrate intake. So there we have the first group of researchers showing that hypertriglyceridemia is becoming more prevalent, and it looks like that's more likely to be linked to heart disease. The next famous scientist was Peter Keogh from Philadelphia, and he ran a clinic for treating patients with abnormal lipid values. And so most patients were sent to him for an investigation to determine whether they had familial hypercholesterolemia. But over the years, he realized that that wasn't the major problem, that the major problem was much more likely to be elevated triglyceride concentrations. And so here's his analysis of 286 patients. And familial hypercholesterolemia, which is generally the lipid abnormality that most people worry about, was present in only 8%. However, hypertriglyceridemia, carbohydrate-induced, was present in the remainder, which was about 92% of patients. So he realized that the problem was much more likely to be carbohydrate-induced hypertriglyceridemia than genetic hypercholesterolemia. And so he wrote, although the majority of patients with atherosclerosis in this series were referred to us for the investigation of hypercholesterolemia, only 8.4% were found to have essential familial hypercholesterolemia. More than 90% were found to have carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia with or without hypercholesterolemia. Thus, it's reasonable to assume that with proper dietary preparation and appropriate laboratory studies, a high incidence of carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia could be demonstrated in persons with atherosclerosis. So he's confirming Albright and Mann's finding that hypertriglyceridemia appears to be the bigger problem. So he then went and did some experiments, and in this slide, you can see the changes in serum cholesterol, phospholipid, and triglyceride concentrations in one individual when on the left they ate the conventional home diet, which was low in fat and high in carbohydrate, and then after 12 months, for the next 20 months, they shifted to a no-sugar, low-carbohydrate diet in which the carbohydrate was less than 150 grams. And notice that's quite a low-carbohydrate diet. And what you observe is that the triglyceride values fall down to normal levels, and interestingly, the cholesterol levels also fall. So he was able to show that you could reverse carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia by a low-carbohydrate diet. He then extended that and looked at 64 patients whom he followed for 16 months. So you can see that when people eat a carbohydrate-restricted diet, their blood triglyceride concentrations come dropping down, and they stay down as long as the patients eat that diet. So he concluded, since patients with carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia suffer primarily from disorders involving exaggerated biosynthesis of triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, etc., carbohydrate restriction should constitute a feasible form of treatment. For practical purposes, it's necessary to eliminate all dietary sugar, sucrose, fructose, and lactose, on account of their high lipemic insulin-stimulating effects and low satiety value, as compared with starches to lower carbohydrate consumption to about 500 calories per day. And he continued, another significant finding of this investigation is the demonstration that sensitivity to simple carbohydrate is widespread amongst healthy and atherosclerotic populations. So he's identifying already that insulin resistance is prevalent in any population. In persons on an ad libitum American diet, lipogenic activities from simple carbohydrates appear to vary from low levels in young girls to very marked degrees in patients with atherosclerosis who are sensitive to carbohydrates, with levels of apparently healthy males scattered in between. So again, showing this concept of insulin resistance which differs between different people. And he concludes the role of this variable cellular response to carbohydrate in human atherosclerosis, as reflected by a rise of very low density lipoprotein and serum triglyceride levels, deserves further and more intensive investigation. So this is said in 1967. And so you would think that surely people looked at triglycerides as a factor in heart disease. And the reality, it never happened. Instead, the focus shifted to cholesterol and the role of dietary fat in the causation of atherosclerosis. And that's one of the remarkable phenomena in modern medical science, is that we had this body of evidence showing that triglycerides driven by carbohydrates and insulin were much higher in persons with heart disease, or more likely to be elevated in persons with heart disease. And then it just shut off, just stopped. And instead, we started talking about cholesterol and low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets. And the question is why, and I think I'll try to answer that one. Cure then did some studies in which he wanted to see whether sugar was a component of causing hypertriglyceridemia. And in this experiment, he took 5 people with hypertriglyceridemia, and he exposed them to 3 different diets. On the left, their self-selected diet. In the middle, a high sugar diet. And on the right, a diet in which the sugar was replaced with the same amount of grams of starch. And what you see is that the conversion in the middle, that the triglyceride concentrations rise dramatically when they eat sugar, and they come down on the starch diet. So he was able to show that sugars compound the problem, that they make the hypertriglyceridemic response worse. So he said the demonstration that high sugar intake can produce hypertriglyceridemia, even in normolipemic subjects, indicates that the dietary habits of the individual and his inherent sugar tolerance are both important in the production of hypertriglyceridemia. And then the final person to look at this topic was Edward Arends, who becomes very important in the 1970s and the 1980s, because he's one of the few people who stands up and says there's no evidence that a low-fat diet can prevent heart disease. And he was also interested in carbohydrate-induced hyperlipidemia. He also showed that there are some people who, when they take fat, they develop a hypertriglyceridemic response. So he said there are 2 forms of hypertriglyceridemia, the one induced by carbohydrates and the one induced by fat. And he was able to show that he proposed that carbohydrate-induced lipemia is a common phenomenon, especially in areas of the world distinguished by calorie abundance and obesity. And that's the model that Raven has shown, his work and the others, showing that it's carbohydrate-induced. He said, whereas fat-induced lipemia is probably a rare familial disorder encountered in all age groups, and that appears to be correct, that there are some people who do not clear fat when they eat it. They lack the enzymes necessary to extract fat from the chylomicrons, and as I understand it, lipoprotein lipase is the main enzyme. So they have a genetic defect in clearing fat from the bloodstream after they've eaten fat. But in contrast to carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia, fat-induced hypertriglyceridemia is not considered to be dangerous or toxic for the individuals. So, I next ask, so what did we know in 1967 as a result of the research of Olbrink, Mann, Q, and Ahrens? And what have we since forgotten? Well, we knew that blood triglyceride concentrations appear to be better predictors of the risk of coronary heart disease than blood cholesterol concentrations, that blood triglyceride concentrations rise in response to carbohydrate ingestion, that individuals differ in the extent to which their blood triglyceride concentrations rise in response to carbohydrate feeding. The extent to which blood triglyceride concentrations rise with carbohydrate feeding is one of the best measures of that individual's degree of insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance. Hence, Q coined the term carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia. Sugar, in the form of sucrose, produced a greater increase in blood triglyceride concentration than did an equivalent amount of starch. This effect was due to the presence of fructose in sucrose, and resulted in upregulation of triglyceride synthesis in both liver and adipose tissue. And they'd also shown that a carbohydrate-restricted diet lowers blood triglyceride concentrations and in some people may also reduce blood cholesterol concentration. So the question is, why was this hard-won knowledge lost? Why did it disappear? Why weren't we taught this at medical school? And why don't we teach it at medical school today? And the answer is that the findings were inconvenient, as they were reported at the exact time that Ancel and the American Heart Association were beginning to demonize fat, especially saturated fat, as the cause of coronary heart disease. Thus, the need arose to glorify carbohydrates, especially whole grains, as uniquely healthy. To achieve this, any finding that carbohydrates may produce undesirable health consequences would have to be suppressed. And the consequence is that we've had 6 decades of the health washing of carbohydrates, which was about to begin in earnest. And a key component of this carbohydrate health washing would have to be the absolute suppression of any mention that carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia is a key, or perhaps the key driver of coronary heart disease. Because if that had been acknowledged, then the whole story would have had to change. So this inconvenient fact would need to be hidden over the next 60 years as the false diet, heart, and lipid hypotheses became the dominant paradigms directing the teaching and conduct of medical professionals around the globe. And so what I plan to do in the next series of talks, and what I've written on the CrossFit.com website, is to explain to you why the diet, heart, and lipid hypotheses are absolutely false, why there never was any evidence to support them, and how there was clear evidence disproving them, which was hidden, especially by Ancel Keys. And what we're going to do next is look at Gerald Raven and show how he contributed to the problem by first showing that when you reduced carbohydrate intake, you could start to reverse these abnormalities in people with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. And instead of going the whole hog and saying, right, if we reduce the carbohydrate intake to well below 40%, we might reverse these conditions. Instead, he stuck at a carbohydrate intake of 40%. And as a consequence, he became one of the proponents who kept the myth that carbohydrates are healthy going. So in the next talk, I'm going to show you how he did that, and perhaps why he did it, and what the consequences have been for the low carbohydrate movement. Because had he been able to show in his experiments already in the 1980s, early 1990s, if he'd done one additional experiment in which he'd cut the carbohydrate content to 5 or 10%, he would have shown that you could reverse diabetes. And that would have set the scene for the low carb movement really taking off. Instead, unfortunately, he hid it. And we're still fighting the consequences.